Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the humanities teaching app. Go download it right now for your iPhone, Android devices. I'm back with Jennifer Avery for our 9th installment of Pride. Oh, no. I believe it's our 10th.
I think it's 10, yeah.
10. Our 10th installment of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. What are we going to be covering today, Jennifer?
We left off at chapter 10 of volume the 2nd, just after Elizabeth had found out from Colonel Fitzwilliam that Mr. Darcy played an instrumental role in keeping Mr. Bingley and her beloved sister Jane apart. And now and of course Elizabeth's still at Rosings, at Hunsford, staying with her friend Charlotte, who's now married to Mr. Collins, Elizabeth's cousin. And so we'll cover probably at least 2 or 3 chapters here. And we're going to start with chapter 11, in which Elizabeth is still stewing over what Colonel Fitzwilliam has told her about how Mr. Darcy takes pride in having saved Mr. Bingley from an inconvenient marriage, or from a bad marriage. And of course, the bad marriage that he's referring to was the possible marriage between Jane and Mr. Bingley. And so Elizabeth's stewing over this. And so she decided to stay home from the Collinses' visit to Rosings to see Lady Catherine, because she's kind of got a headache and she's got a lot to think about. And so what she does is she decides to go back over Jane's letters. And she goes through Jane's letters, and she kind of picks up on some things that she didn't pick up on when she read them the first time. And that is that although Jane doesn't really say anything about the Bingley situation, doesn't say anything to really confess how bad she feels, or what kind of state she's in, Elizabeth can tell by reading between the lines that Jane's not quite as cheerful as she usually is. She's not quite herself. And so all of this really just really burns her up, because now she knows it's Mr. Darcy's fault. And just as she's thinking about all of this, she thinks, oh, well, at least Mr. Darcy's leaving soon. And she's like, well, that means that Colonel Fitzwilliam's leaving too, and I'd hate to lose him, but, he doesn't really have any intentions for me anyway, so I'm not going to worry about it. And just as she's deciding on this, a knock comes at the door at the parsonage, and of course it's just Elizabeth there. And so she thinks it's Colonel Fitzwilliam coming to check on her. But turns out it's Mr. Darcy. And Mr. Darcy, the minute he steps into the room with Elizabeth, she can tell that there's something going on. Because Darcy's kind of pacing. He seems kind of irritated or kind of out of his wits, as it were. And so he's pacing. And, she kind of, says, okay, how are you? How's everybody doing? Yeah. And then Darcy just completely blows her mind and says, in vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. And so this just completely flabbergasts Lizzie. Darcy is in love with her, and she had not figured, even though the reader kind of knows this, Lizzie doesn't. And so she's astonished. And she sits there and kind of, is still kind of taking it all in while he starts in. And what he says does not really make her any happier. Austen doesn't go through the whole speech here. And I think it's really interesting that she doesn't, because if she had gone into the actual dialogue of what Mr. Darcy said, then it probably would have been kind of trite. Exactly the kind of stuff that your Anne Radcliffe's would have written, probably. And so she kind of just sums it up. He spoke well, but there were feelings besides those of the heart to be detailed. And he was not more eloquent on the subject of tenderness than of pride. His sense of her inferiority, of its being a degradation, of the family obstacles which judgment had always opposed to inclination, were dwelt on with a warmth which seemed due to the consequence he was wounding, but was very unlikely to recommend his suit. So he ends up asking her to marry him. But in the process of asking her to marry him, he says, well, I realize that to marry you would be a degradation, that my family would not be happy. I'm not happy to take on, to connect myself with a family like yours, but I still want you to marry me. And in a way, it's kind of romantic, but in a way, it's also extremely insulting. So Lizzie is just like, are you kidding me? And then there's this last little bit that kind of sums it all up. He concluded with representing to her the strength of that attachment which, in spite of all his endeavors, he had found impossible to conquer, and with expressing his hope that it would now be rewarded by her acceptance of his hand. As he said this, she could easily see that he had no doubt of a favorable answer. He spoke of apprehension and anxiety, but his countenance expressed real security. Such a circumstance could only exasperate farther, and when he ceased, the color rose into her cheeks, and she said, in such cases as this, it is, I believe, the established mode to express a sense of obligation for the sentiments avowed, however unequally they may be returned. It is natural that obligation should be felt, and if I could feel gratitude, I would now thank you, but I cannot. I have never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. I am sorry to have occasioned pain to anyone. It has been most unconsciously done, however, and I hope will be of short duration. The feelings which you tell me have long prevented the acknowledgment of your regard can have little difficulty in overcoming it after this explanation. Oh, snap. Essentially what she says here, to translate into modern English, is, you know, when a dude asks you to marry him, most people think that it's nice to kind of say, to express an obligation, to let them down easy. But I can't do that with you. I don't feel any kind of gratitude. I cannot thank you for flattering me with your proposal because you suck. Essentially, that's what she says. But she is actually very kind and considerate, and she says, I hope that your pain will be of short duration. But before she says this, it's clear that he thinks that she's going to say yes. He seems to have no question that she's going to say yes. But she just completely floors him with this, and he shows it. He kind of gets agitated, and he gets a little bit red in the face, and he starts pacing again. And he is amazed that she's saying no. And he says, and this is all the reply which I am to have the honor of expecting. I might perhaps wish to be informed why, with so little endeavor at civility, I am thus rejected, but is of small importance. And then Lizzie comes back and says, well, why did you ask me to marry you at all if you have all these feelings against me and my family? And then she brings up the issue with Bingley and Jane. And Darcy he turns a little bit red, but he seems to show no remorse in that. He says he's proud of it, and he even tells her, I'm proud. I'm glad that I did this. And that just makes Lizzie even madder. And then she throws Mr. Wickham in his face. She says, well, I already knew that I didn't like you as soon as Mr. Wickham told me about what you did to him. And Darcy gets a little bit, his attitude kind of changes. He says, you take an eager interest in that gentleman's concerns. So he's a little bit jealous, said Darcy in a less tranquil tone and with a heightened color. Who that knows what his misfortunes have been can help feeling an interest in him. His misfortunes, repeated Darcy contemptuously. Yes, his misfortunes have been great indeed. And of your infliction, cried Elizabeth with energy. And after all of this, and then she goes a little bit farther into all of Mr. Wickham's misfortunes, and she says, you can do this to him, and you can continue to speak of him with this sarcasm, this contempt. And Darcy just says, and this is your opinion of me, and he's getting mad. He's actually getting mad, and he's pacing more. He's pacing furiously across this room now. This is the estimation in which you hold me. I thank you for explaining it so fully. My faults, according to this calculation, are heavy indeed. But perhaps, added he, stopping in his walk and turning towards her, these offences might have been overlooked, had not your pride been hurt by my honest confession of the scruples that had long prevented my forming any serious design. These bitter accusations might have been suppressed, had I, with greater policy, concealed my struggles, and flattered you into the belief of my being impelled by unqualified, unalloyed inclination, by reason, by reflection, by everything. But disguise of every sort is my abhorrence. Nor am I ashamed of the feelings I related. They were natural and just. Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections, to congratulate myself on the hope of relations whose condition in life is so decidedly beyond my own? And he says this, but to sum this up, he's like, well, and he makes a reference to Lizzie's pride. And she's the one who's been accusing him of pride all this time. And now he's accusing her of it. And the way that what he's saying here basically is, would you have answered differently? Maybe you would have said yes if I had flattered you instead of being honest. And that's an important part here that you really have to take from this little conversation here, is that Darcy is being honest. He's not disguising anything. He's not using flowery language. He's not trying to flatter her. He's being honest. And although Lizzie doesn't see it now, she will later. But then he screws this up by again pronouncing her family to be beneath him. And this just makes her so mad. And this is what she says, and this is extremely important too. You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me in any other way than as it spared me the concern which I might have felt in refusing you, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. Now this is important, because Lizzie is right. She's right about this. Even though he's being honest, he's being a little bit too brusque. Now, in this day and age, in modern America particularly, brutal honesty is sort of admired. Even though a lot of, now granted, that's the subject for debate, because when people are brutally honest, then people don't always react well. But we do have more respect for that than they would have at this time, because it's not that people were dishonest back then. It's just that honest feelings could be more tactfully explained. And now we're just blunt about it. But back then you had to be really tactful with people. He's not really being very tactful here. And so he's not behaving like a gentleman. And this is something that really, you can visibly see it in the narrative, that Darcy is struck by this. Had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. Because he prides himself on being a gentleman of the highest order. Like, he feels like he is the embodiment of being a gentleman. And Lizzie's declaration of, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner, makes him see that maybe he's not as gentlemanly as he thinks he is. And that's only fair, because Lizzie comes to a lot of realizations as a result of this too. So, and then she goes on to tell him that that he could not have asked her to marry him in any way that would have induced her to say yes. Because even before the mess with Wickham, before the mess with Jane, she already decided that she didn't like him. And she says, from the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, were such as to form that groundwork of disapprobation, which means disapproval, on which succeeding events have built so immovable a dislike. And I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry. Ouch. And so right after this, he says, you've said quite enough, madam. I perfectly comprehend your feelings, and have now only to be ashamed of what my own have been. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness. And he just leaves. So essentially what Lizzie just told him was, you know what? I didn't like you from the get-go, because you're such a proud, disagreeable person. And I decided a long time ago that you were the last person I could ever think about marrying, ever. Again, that's a big ouch for a guy like Darcy. A guy who is worth £10,000 a year, which is basically millionaire status in today's money. And $1 million a year at least. And he's this really well-regarded guy that everybody knows and everybody thinks highly of, and she's saying no to him. And this really knocks him down several pegs. And so, and this is one of the great things about Lizzie, and this is why she's considered one of the greatest female characters in English literature, because she lays it out. She lets him know how she feels. She doesn't say yes just because she's supposed to say yes. She is strong enough to know herself enough and to have enough regard for herself to not sink herself in a bad marriage with somebody she doesn't like. Again, it may not seem like feminism, but it totally is. Back in that day, it was almost and it was almost considered rude to say no to anybody who asked you to marry them, especially somebody of Darcy's rank. Like any woman, any other woman in this entire book would have thought Lizzie was crazy for saying no to him. But she says no because her own feelings won't allow it. Now, again, she's a very strong character for this reason. And again, this is why she's so important to literature. And after he leaves, Lizzie is so confused and annoyed and mad that she just sits down and cries for half an hour. And she sits there and thinks over everything. And this last little bit, that she should receive an offer of marriage from Mr. Darcy, that he should have been in love with her for so many months, so much in love as to wish to marry her in spite of all the objections which had made him prevent his friends marrying her sister, and which must appear at least with equal force in his own case, was almost incredible. It was gratifying to have inspired unconsciously so strong an affection. But his pride, his abominable pride, his shameless avowal of what he had done with respect to Jane, his unpardonable assurance in acknowledging, though he could not justify it, and the unfeeling manner in which he had mentioned Mr. Wickham, his cruelty towards whom he had not attempted to deny, soon overcame the pity which the consideration of his attachment had for a moment excited. So for a minute, Lizzie thinks, well, man, he must have it bad if he's asking me to marry him despite all of these things that he advised Bingley against when he wanted to marry Jane. Well, that's kind of awesome, you know. But then she goes back and says, well, but then he's so proud of himself for separating Jane and Bingley, and he didn't deny doing what Wickham said he did to him. So that kind of chases all of that away. And so pretty much for the rest of the night, Lizzie is just mired in thinking about all of this mess that she has just encountered. And that's pretty much how the chapter ends. She leaves, she goes back up to her own room before Charlotte and Mr. Collins get home. And that's the end of chapter 11. In chapter 12, Lizzie wakes up the next morning, and she's still reeling from all of this mess. And so she decides to go and take a walk. But because she knows that Darcy knows where she likes to walk, she goes to a different spot. But she ends up near that area, and she happens to see Mr. Darcy there. And she tries to kind of back away and try to keep him from seeing her, and kind of tries to sneak off, but he sees her first, and he starts coming towards her, and he hands her a letter. And Lizzie is so curious about this letter that she just can't help reading it. And so, and this is kind of important too, this letter is like 2 pages long in a close hand. So a piece of parchment about like that. That's 2 pages of this, and in a very small hand. So he had a lot to say. And so Lizzie decides to go through this whole letter. And that's pretty much all of the chapters, this letter. And Darcy starts off by saying, don't be alarmed. I'm not going to ask you to marry you again. I just want you to know about some things. And he says, you've laid 2 offenses at my door. And my conscience and my self-worth demand that I try to explain myself. And he actually makes a really good point here. Okay, the first mentioned was that regardless of the sentiments of either, I had detached Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other that I had, in defiance of various claims, in defiance of honor and humanity, ruined the immediate prosperity and blasted the prospects of Mr. Wickham. Wilfully and wantonly to have thrown off the companion of my youth, the acknowledged favorite of my father, a young man who had scarcely any other dependence than on our patronage, and who had been brought up to expect its exertion, would be a depravity, to which the separation of two young persons whose affection could be the growth of only a few weeks could bear no comparison. So he's saying, you equally laid these two charges at my door, but one of them is much greater than the other. And the lesser of these two offenses is Jane and Bingley. And first he explains his point of view with the Jane and Bingley thing. And so he kind of goes into talking about how he noticed that Mr. Bingley had liked Jane. And he had noticed it from the get-go, but he didn't think much of it because he had seen Mr. Bingley in love before. And so he didn't think much of it until the dance of Netherfield. At the dance at Netherfield, Sir William Lucas had come up to Darcy and said something about Jane and Bingley getting married, and it became clear to Darcy that the neighborhood pretty much expected it, like it was going to happen, and so that kind of made the alarm bells go off in Darcy's head. And so as a consequence of that, he watched Bingley that night. And he admits that Bingley seemed to be much more connected or much more attached to Jane than he had ever seen him with any other woman. And so he sees this, and so he starts to watch Jane too. But he says that, let me see. Your sister I also watched. Her look and manners were open, cheerful, and engaging as ever, but without any symptom of peculiar regard. And I've remained convinced from the evening's scrutiny that though she received his attentions with pleasure, she did not invite them by any participation of sentiment. If you have not been mistaken here, I must have been in an error. Your superior knowledge of your sister must make the latter probable. If it be so, if I have been misled by such error to inflict pain on her, your resentment has not been unreasonable. Wow. So Darcy even admits, well, maybe I was wrong because you know your sister better than I do, but what I saw was this girl was paying attention to Bingley, but she didn't really seem to care much about him. She really didn't seem to be in love with him. And Lizzie has kind of hinted that Jane's really kind of a quiet, reserved girl, and so she wouldn't show a lot, even if she cared, even if she was in love with Bingley, it probably wouldn't be obvious to everybody. And so, and Darcy, like I said, he admits that he might have been wrong there, and but then he goes into this, and he says, but I shall not scruple to assert that the serenity of your sister's countenance and air was such as might have given the most acute observer a conviction that, however amiable her temper, her heart was not likely to be easily touched. And then he goes on to, and he says this too. He says, I didn't believe her to be indifferent because I wished it. I believed it on impartial conviction, as truly as I wished it in reason. And my objection to the marriage were not merely those which I last night acknowledged to have required the utmost force of passion to put aside in my own case. The want of connection could not be so great an evil to my friend as to me. So, and even in this, while he's, basically saying, yes, I separated Bingley and Jane because I didn't think she really cared much for him. he still is kind of trying to convince her how much he loves Lizzie by saying, again, let me read it again. My objections to the marriage were not merely those which I last night acknowledged to have required the utmost force of passion to put aside in my own case. So as much the same reasons, even though I have even more reason to not want to be connected with your family than Bingley, I still can't overcome the feelings I have for you. I'm that much in love with you. And so he's still kind of almost trying to win her over in this very subtle way. It's just like, but in any case, but he goes on to talk about the situation of Lizzie's mother's family, about her low connections. But then he goes into this. And he says, the situation of your mother's family, though objectionable, was nothing in comparison of that total want of propriety, so frequently, so almost uniformly betrayed by herself, by your 3 younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Pardon me, it pains me to offend you, but amidst your concern for the defects of your nearest relations, and your displeasure at this representation of them, let it give you consolation to consider that to have conducted yourselves so as to avoid any share of the like censure is praise no less generally bestowed on you and your eldest sister, than it is honorable to the sense and disposition of both. So she says it's not just the money thing. It's not just the rank thing. He says that your family act like idiots is basically what he's saying here. Your mom is vulgar. Your little sisters are stupid and silly. And even your dad can be a jerk, is what he's saying here. But then
now I'm gonna just have to weigh in here for a second.
Okay.
Because the last time I muted myself for this long, you went a little off the rails in regards to language. I see you getting worked up.
I'm working on it.
But I love the passion.
Thanks.
So keep going.
Okay.
So keep going.
So basically, like I said, so he's saying that it's not just the money, it's the behavior too. It's all this bad behavior. But he adds this little compliment. He basically says here that even though the rest of your family act like idiots half of the time, you and Jane are very well mannered, and it speaks even more to your character that you can manage to be well mannered when you have this to deal with. So he gives her a little compliment there. And let me see here. Okay, and so then he kind of goes into what happened after the Netherfield ball, and that is that Bingley had left Netherfield the night or the day after the ball, and he had planned on coming back really soon. But because the sisters and Darcy had kind of apparently had a conversation about how worried they were about Bingley getting attached to Jane. And so, in order to keep Bingley from coming back so quickly, they all left and joined him in London, trying to keep him there. And so, and when they were all got there, they all 3 of them, that is Darcy, Caroline Bingley, and Mrs. Hurst, Bingley's sisters. Sorry. Okay, so that they all went to London to try to talk him out of it, essentially. They had all come to this conclusion that Bingley wanted to marry Jane, they should try to prevent it. And so they kind of start trying to convince him that it was a bad idea. And the material concerns wouldn't have been enough to convince Bingley not to marry. And Darcy says this. He says that the material concerns of Bingley marrying Jane would not have kept him from asking her to marry him. But what kind of convinced Bingley that he shouldn't is that Darcy says that it didn't seem like Jane had equal feelings for him. And so basically what he's saying here is that he convinced Bingley not to ask Jane to marry him because he convinced Bingley that Jane wasn't really that much in love with him. But in any case, so there's that, and with this little bit here too. He had before believed her to return his affection with sincere, if not equal, regard, but Bingley has great natural modesty, with a deeper dependence on my judgment than on his own, to convince him. Therefore, that he had deceived himself was no very difficult point. To persuade him against returning into Hertfordshire when that conviction had been given was scarcely the work of a moment. I cannot blame myself for having done thus much. But there is one part of my conduct in the whole affair on which I do not reflect with satisfaction. It is that I condescended to adopt the measures of art so far as to conceal from him your sister's being in town. And so he basically says, I don't really blame myself for convincing Bingley that your sister wasn't in love with him, but I don't really feel great about not letting him know she was in town, or to keep from him that she was in town. But in any case, so he pretty much wraps that up, and he says, don't worry, that's pretty much it. I have no more apologies to offer. And, I've told you all the truth of this matter, and I'm sorry if I was wrong. That pretty much wraps that up. And then the second one is the Wickham thing. And here we get some pretty interesting information about Mr. Wickham. My father supported him at school and afterwards at Cambridge. Most important assistance, as his own father, always poor from the extravagance of his wife, would have been unable to give him a gentleman's education. My father was not only fond of this young man's society, whose manners were always engaging, he had also the highest opinion of him, and hoping the church would be his profession, intended to provide for him in it. As for myself, it is many, many years since I first began to think of him in a very different manner. The vicious propensities, the want of principle, which he was careful to guard from the knowledge of his best friend, could not escape the observation of a young man of nearly the same age with himself, and who had opportunities of seeing him in unguarded moments, which Mr. Darcy could not have. So, basically, Darcy's saying here is like, my father really cared about this guy. He wanted to provide for him. He wanted Wickham to go into the church, and so to the point that he paid for his schooling, and he paid for him to go to college at Cambridge, and he wanted him to join the church. But Darcy says, but although my father really thought highly of him, I saw him in unguarded moments, which he didn't show to my dad. I saw him acting, like I said, displaying a want of principle, which means that he's not a good person. He does not have good morals. And Darcy sees that when his father did not. Here again, I shall give you pain. To what degree you only can tell. But whatever may be the sentiments which Mr. Wickham has created, a suspicion of their nature shall not prevent me from unfolding his real character. It adds even another motive. I think that's a smooth little line here. It's just like Darcy had noticed that He probably heard that Lizzie spent a lot of time with Mr. Wickham, and he was jealous, essentially. And that's kind of what he's saying here. So, in any case, after Darcy's father died, Mr. Wickham's father died not long after that. And in Darcy's father's will, he had promised him this living, which is basically a church parish with a house and everything on it. And he says, within half a year from these events, Mr. Wickham wrote to inform me that having finally resolved against taking orders, which means joining the church, he hoped I should not think it unreasonable for him to expect some more immediate pecuniary advantage in lieu of the preferment, by which he could not be benefited. He had some intention, he added, of studying the law, and I must be aware that the interest of £1,000 would be a very insufficient support therein. I rather wished than believed him to be sincere, but at any rate was perfectly ready to accede to his proposal. So when Wickham said that I don't want to join the church, so I know your dad told me I could have this living, but since it's not going to do me any good, since I'm not going to go into the church, give me $3,000. And Darcy does that. So he says, I want to study the law, give me $3,000. And Darcy gives him the money. And then, come to find out, when Wickham leaves with his $3,000, he's not really studying the law. He's just living in London and not doing anything. He's not studying the law, he's not doing anything. And when the man who had the living died, when the person who had the living died, that would have been when Wickham would have taken possession of it. But again, remember, Wickham doesn't want to go into the church, so Darcy gave him $3,000. But when the fella dies, Wickham comes back again and asks for more money. Actually, he decides that he's going to go into the church. Yes, let me have the living now, because I'm not going to do the law. I want to go ahead and take this living because this guy's dead now. But Darcy doesn't do it because he knows that Wickham's just trying to play him. And he knew that the reason why Wickham wanted this living so soon after the guy died is because he was broke. He had spent all of his money and he had done nothing with it. And so Darcy says no. And that makes Wickham really angry, but Darcy doesn't hear from him for years. Until Darcy's sister goes from school to London to a place in Ramsgate, which is on the coast. And the lady who is watching her, who's living with her, basically acting as like a chaperone where Georgiana Darcy is living. She and Wickham apparently kind of conspired to get Georgiana Darcy to marry Wickham. So Wickham tries to convince her that he's in love with her. But Darcy knows that the reason he wants her to marry her is because of her £30,000. And so essentially this whole history paints this picture of a Wickham who doesn't do anything useful, and all he ever does is try to get money. And he's trying to leech it out of this same family over and over again. And he's even trying to steal away Darcy's sister, who was 15 years old when he tried to convince her to elope. And even back in those days, 15 was way too young. Like, most women got married around 18 during this time, and 15 was considered too young. But Wickham tries to convince Georgiana to elope, but Georgiana tells Darcy about it, and so she doesn't do it. And from then on, he doesn't hear from Wickham until he sees him in Hertfordshire talking to the Bennets. And so we find out that basically everything Wickham told Lizzie is a complete and utter lie. Yes, he refused. Yes, it's true, Darcy refused him the living, but only after Wickham was given £3,000 to not take the living. And, you know, it's all these deceptions have been opened up for Lizzie, and Darcy even says, I'm not the only one who knows about all this. Colonel Fitzwilliam knows about it too, so he can prove it. If you need proof, you can ask him. This is something that Wickham does not provide, that Wickham never provided when he told this whole history. Darcy has given her somebody to corroborate the information with. So that's pretty much the end of that. That's the end of chapter 12. And so here we are. Darcy has asked Lizzie to marry him. She has said no, giving these reasons that he's too proud and he's not the kind of person for her, and he did all this crap to Mr. Wickham, and he kept Jane from marrying Bingley. But then she gets this letter, and everything is explained, and actually explained pretty well. And Mr. Wickham has now been exposed as a liar. And that's where we leave at chapter 12. So,
Well, I want to thank you very much, Jennifer. Excellent lesson, as usual. I will have this on the Noetic app, and it should later this evening, and it should process and be up on YouTube momentarily. And you can also listen on SoundCloud. And we'll be back soon with another installment, and we'll just keep trucking through Pride and Prejudice. Thanks again, Jennifer.
Thanks.